We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Gemara in Meseches Bava Kamma. This is Bava Kamma Daf 105b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara quoted the Mishnah which says that if a person steals chametz and then Pesach arrives, he just says Harei shel chalaf v'nacha. Even though the chametz is essentially not worth anything, he just gives the chametz back to the nigzal. Now the halacha is if the chametz is not around anymore, let's say it gets stolen from the gazlan, or let's say it's destroyed, so then he actually owes money to the nigzal. And so Rava now asks, Nishba olav ma, what if the person takes a false oath regarding the chametz? As Rashi says, Nishba olav la'achar shenesar, after that chametz becomes prohibited and is essentially worthless, Nishba shein etzlo v'lo gazlo mimenu. So the gazlan takes a false oath. He says he doesn't have the chametz by him. He never stole from him. What's the halacha in that case? And the Gemara explains, Mi amrinon do we say? Kevon de imignev, since if this chametz was stolen from the gazlan, boy shalumele, so he's going to actually have to pay money. This could end up costing him money in theory. So memona kakafarle, so then with his shvua, he is denying actual money. It's a monetary claim against him that he is denying with a false shvua. And so then all of the halachas of the false shvua apply, meaning to say if he admits that he swore falsely, he'll have to pay the fifth, bring the carbon asham, etc. Odilmer maybe hashtamias hamanach. Right now the chametz is here. The afra bialmo, and the chametz is considered like the dust of the earth, like nothing. It's not worth anything. Velo kafar le memona, and therefore he hasn't really denied any monetary obligation, and so there wouldn't be the halacha of paying the fifth, of bringing the carbon asham, etc. And the Gemara says, Milsati boy leila Rava. This issue, which was a question to Rava, pshita leila Rabba, was actually obvious to Rabba. The Yomar Rabba, because Rabba says, Shori ganafta. Let's say a person says, you stole my axe. Vu Omer lo ganafti, and he says, I didn't steal it. Mativo etzlacha, what's it doing by you? And he says, Shomer chinam ani olav. I'm actually a shomer chinam over the axe. I didn't steal it. I'm a shomer chinam. So in that situation, chayiv, he's going to be chayiv. Sharei potter atzmo mi geneva v'aveda, because by claiming he's a shomer chinam, when it's not true, but he is getting himself out of situations of geneva v'aveda. Or let's say shomer sachar ani olav. Let's say he says, I'm a shomer sachar. I didn't steal it, but I'm a shomer sachar. Chayiv, he's also chayiv. Sharei potter atzmo mi shavuru umesu, because as a shomer sachar, if the animal breaks its leg, if the animal dies, in those situations, he's not going to be responsible. If he's a ganav, then he is going to be responsible. So with this false claim of his, he's trying to get out of those scenarios. He's trying to make himself potter, and so therefore in those situations as well, that is a denial that can cause him to be chayiv, let's say a carbon and the added fifth, etc., in those situations. Or shoel ani Oliver, let's say he says, I'm a borrower and I'm not a thief. Also in that case, chayiv, he's chayiv, sharei potter atzma, because with his claim, he's trying to make himself exempt, mimesa machmas malacha, shoel is potter, let's say it dies while it's working. That's not true again by a ganav. Therefore with his claim, again, he's trying to exempt himself from a monetary obligation, and therefore it could involve, if there's a false shvua involved, and then he admits it could involve the added fifth payment and the carbon asham, etc. And the point over here is, alma we see, afal gav de hakaim, even though this shore is right here, it's in front of us, but kevon de imignav, but since if it were to get stolen, so then again he would be obligated in some scenarios, but with the claims that he's making, he's trying to get out of it. So memona kakafar, it counts as though he's denying a monetary claim. And so hashtanami, so now also memona kakafar, it's considered that he's denying an actual monetary claim, since again, if it would be stolen from him as a gazlan, he would be responsible, and now he's trying to get out of that. So hachanami, so here also, afagav di afra bialmahu, even though this chametz is really like the dust of the earth, it's like nothing, kevon di imignav, since if it would be stolen from him, boy shalume le memona ma'alya, he has to pay back money. So hashtanami, so now also when he's claiming that he didn't steal it, memona kakafar, it's considered like he's denying an actual monetary claim. And Rashi explains, Shomer Chinam Ani Olav, the person denies being a ganav or a gazlan, but he says, I am a Shomer Chinam, v'nishba v'hoda, and then he takes a false oath about that, and then he admits that he took a false oath. So Chayev, carbon shvu, he's Chayev, the carbon shvu, exactly like a situation where a person takes a false oath and then admits later. Aval pi shahoda kodem shvua beguf hamamon, even though he admitted before the false shvua, he admitted that he owed the money, meaning he said he's a Shomer Chinam, he was just denying one aspect. He was saying he's a Shomer Chinam and not a gazlan, but still, Sharei Potter Atzmo b'shvua, because with this oath, he was exempting himself, migneva v'aveda. He was exempting himself from, let's say, it gets stolen from him, or it's lost from him, a shomer chinam is not responsible. Shem haya nignav mimenu mishvua ve'elach haya niftar b'divrei sheker. Had it been stolen from him from that point in time when he claimed and took an oath that he was a shomer chinam, he would have been potter, and that was through words that were a lie. Sharehu atzmo ganvo, because he himself was really the ganav. V'chayiv b'chol onsen ad sheyachzirenu. The halacha by a ganav is he's chayiv in all onsen until he returns it. And Shoel Potter b'meisa machmas malacha mechachesh basar machmas malacha. By a Shoel, he's exempt. Let's say it dies because you were working the animal in the normal fashion, or it gets weaker because you're working the animal. To lemevad malacha shaili, because the whole point is that he borrowed it to do work, so he's not responsible for that. V'lav l'ukma v'chilsa, nobody's borrowing an animal in order to just lock it up and to do nothing with it. Afal gav dehakaim, so even though it's right here, umodele begave, meaning the animal's right in front of us, and he's admitting that he owes it. V'hashta iu lo kafar midi, so in a sense he's not denying anything. Afilu hachi keven d'shem sofa shvua lavuli de kfir asmam chayv, but nevertheless, since it could be that this shvua really will be a denial of a monetary claim, therefore he's chayiv. Hachanami here also, afal gav de kfira de chametz kohodahu, even though the denial of the chametz is really like an admission to afra bialmu, because it's like mere dirt. Keven d'shem yovad v'yischayiv lo mamon, since maybe it is going to be destroyed, and then he will have a monetary obligation. And therefore it would come out that the shvua would actually, could potentially make him exempt from a monetary obligation. So chayiv, he's going to be chayiv in that situation in the carbon shvua. And the Gemara continues, Yosef Rabba v'Kamma l'Hashmait, the Rabba was sitting and he said over this sugya, Eiser Rav Amram l'Rav, and Rav Amram asked Rava the following question from a brisa. The brisa says, V'chichesh ba, this is in the psukim by carbon shvu, it says that the person has to deny the monetary claim, and it means that it has to be a real denial. Prat l'moda be'ikr, this would exclude a situation where a person fundamentally admits to his obligation. Ketzad, how so? What would be an example of a case where the person is moda be'ikr, it's not really v'chichesh ba? Shori ganavta, let's say the person says, you stole my ox. V'hu amar, he says, lo ganavti, he says, I didn't steal the ox. Mativo etzlecha, what's it doing by you? Aton machartoli, so he says, you sold it to me. Aton esato li b'matana, you gave it to me as a gift. Avicha machruli, your father sold it to me. Avicha nasnu li b'matana, your father gave it to me as a gift. Achar parasi rotz, it ran after my cow into my domain. Me'elav bo etzlir, came on its own into my domain. Toa b'derech mitzasiv, it was wandering on the road and I found it. Shomer chinam ani olav, I'm a shomer chinam on the shore. Shomer Sachar Ani Olav, I'm a Shomer Sachar, I'm a paid watchman on the shore. Shoel Ani Olav, I'm a borrower of the shore. In all of these situations, Vinishban, he takes an oath and it's a false oath. Vahoda, he admits that it's a false oath. So Yachol Yehei Chayev, I might think that in all of these cases he's Chayev a carbon shvua. The Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says V'chichesh, but he has to deny it. It has to be a real denial. Prat l'moda be'ikr, to exclude all of these cases where he's fundamentally admitting that he owes the money. And Rashi says, Atam mecharta, you sold it to me. L'kamon parach. The Gemara will ask on this later on. My moda be'ikr iko. What's the admission over here that he's fundamentally admitting? If he says you sold it to me, so he's saying it really is his. He's not admitting anything. The Gemara will address that point. Toa b'derech mitzasiv. Again, it was wandering on the road, and I found it. V'hevi Yosef l'bayis. I brought it into the house because it was an aveda. And the Gemara continues, Amar Le Rabba responded to Rav Amram's question, Tadura, some translate this as fool, some translate it as scatterbrain. Rashi says, Tadura, Ein Lev, one with no heart, not paying attention. The point is, this question is not a question on me at all. Kitanya hi, because what was this brisa referring to? The Ka'amar Le Helach, that's referring to a situation where the person presents the ox right back to the person claiming it, gives it to him immediately. In those situations, we say, even though there is a denial, but since there's a fundamental admission, and he's saying Helach, so there's no carbon shavua. But Kiko Amina, but what was I talking about? The Kaima Ba'agam. I'm talking about a situation where it was out in the swamp. In a situation where it's out in the swamp, it's not right in front of us, so there is a possibility that something will happen. It won't be able to be returned, and therefore with this claim, he is getting out of some liability, and that's why in a case where it's in the Agam, there will in fact be a carbon shavua. And Rashi explains, Halach, he says, here it is, V'leka l'meimer, so you can't say in such a situation, Ilu mignav, that if it were to get stolen, so then these claims are getting him out of the liability, that's not true. Ta'akamei kai, because it's standing right in front of us, V'shakale, and he takes it, so that's why in those situations there is no carbon shvua, but if he's potentially getting out of liability, then we say there is carbon shvua. And the Gemara now asks the question that Rashi alluded to before, Atam mechartali, so it says, you sold it to me, that's his counterclaim. My moda be'ikr iko, what admission is there in the main claim over here? What's he admitting? He's saying you sold it to me, he's saying it's mine, there's no admission at all. The Gemara says, lo no tzrich, it's necessary. The Amarle, he tells him, lo nasati lo chadami, I never gave you money for it. You sold it to me, and I never paid you, and therefore shkil torach vizil, take your ox and go. So he essentially is admitting to the person that he can take back the ox. Atan asatali, or then there's the counterclaim that you gave it to me, avicha nasnuli, or your father gave it to me. The same question, my moda be'ikar ika, how is he admitting to the main part of the claim in this case? He's saying it really is his. It was given to me as a gift by either you or your father. And the Gemara says to that, the Yomar Lei says to him, Al menas da'avid noloch na'ich denafsha. There was a condition that I do something that's pleasing for you, that you gave me this gift. V'lo avdi lach, I didn't do what you requested, and so therefore again this gift goes back. Shkil torach v'zil, take your ox and you can go. So again, he is fundamentally admitting in this case. And the Gemara continues, Tov b'derech mitzasiv. What about the claim where he says it was wandering on the road and I found it? Lema, he should say back, Iboy lach ladureli, that you should have returned it to me. If he found it on the road, what kind of claim is that? That's a simple case of Hashavas Aveda. And the Gemara says, Amar Avuad Shmuel, the father of Shmuel said, B'omer Shvua Aveda Motzasi, he says, an oath, I found the Aveda, v'lo hayisi yodea shishalcha, shachzirenolach, but I didn't know that it was yours. I didn't know that I would be able to return it. I didn't know that it belonged to you, and that was his counterclaim in this case. And the Gemara continues, Tanya, we learned in a Braisa, Amar Ben Azai says, Gimel Shvuah, saying there are three cases involving Shvuah Sa'edus. That is the oath that a person takes that he doesn't know any testimony in a particular case. And Ben Azai has three scenarios that are relevant to the Shvuah Sa'edus. The first case is Hikir Ba V'lo B'motza. Let's say we're talking about a lost object, and really the person did have some knowledge. He knew what the lost object was, he recognized it, but he didn't recognize the one who found it. Or B'motza V'lo Bar, let's say he recognized the one who found it, but he didn't recognize the object, and so in these cases he has some knowledge, so somewhat he was telling the truth because he doesn't know everything about the lost object, but he did have some knowledge and he swore that he knew nothing. And then finally the last scenario, lo ba v'lo b'motza, he doesn't know anything about it and he doesn't know anything about the one who found it. The Gemara immediately asks on this third case, lo ba v'lo b'motza, he doesn't know anything about it or the one who found it, so then kushte shtaba, so then he was telling the truth. He was taking a true shvua when he said he didn't know anything because he didn't know anything. And the Gemara says, you're right, ema ba uva motza, rather say what Ben Azai meant is that the third case is he knew about it and he knew about the one who found it. In this case as well, he was taking a false shvua. So there are three cases of false shvuas that are relevant to this aid. And the Gemara says, Lamai Hilchasa. The Gemara says, well, to what practical halach is this relevant? And we have a machlokas amoroim. Rav Ami Amar Rabbi Chanina. Rav Ami says that Rabbi Chanina says liftor, that in these cases he's actually potter from the carbon shvuas aedus. Generally there is a carbon that is brought if it turns out that he swore falsely. In these cases he's going to be potter. Ushmuel Amar L'chiv. And Shmuel says, no, in these cases he's actually going to be chayiv, because it is essentially a false shvua that he has taken, and therefore he's chayiv the carbon shvuas aedus. And we'll take a look at Rashi over here. Shalosh shvuas, saying there are three oaths. Be'edus aveda. We're talking here specifically about testimony on a lost object. Sheishbia esaed, that we make the aid take a shvua. Imro'isa avedasi. Did you see my lost object? V'yamar lav, and he says no. V'achakach choda. Then he admits that he was actually taking a false shvua. And again, there's various scenarios. Hikir ba v'lo b'motza. He did recognize it, not the one who found it. Meaning ha'aveda she'amar shara osam ha'lechas b'rishus acheres. He did see the lost animal that was walking in a different rishus. Ve'inu yodea mihu. He didn't know who it belonged to. Oh hoda shehikir b'motzer. Let's say he admits that he recognized the one who found it. V'lo ba, but not it. V'hayolo lomer. He should have said ish ploni motza aveda. So and so found an aveda, found the lost object. Ve'inu yodea, and I don't know him shalchohu if it's yours. Uve'ed echad kamayri. And Rashi notes over here that in all of these cases we're talking about where there's just one aid. So we're not talking about a situation where you have two aidim, but we're talking about where there is one aid, and it is possible that had he told us the truth, we would have been able to track down the item. So we have a machlokas amoraim in these cases, whether he's chayav a carbon shvua. One says liftor al kulon pater aid. One says that in all of these cases, the aid is going to be pater from the carbon shvua in these situations. And the Gemara now continues and says, uvepluksa dahani tanoi. This machlokas amoraim is actually the same machlokas as the following machlokas tanoim. And the Gemara says, the Tanya, as we learned in a Braisa, hamashbia eid echad. Somebody makes one witness swear. Again, Rashi says that the discussion above was also with one witness. So in such a situation, we have a machlokas tanoim. The first opinion is pater, that the aid is going to be pater from the carbon shvuas aedus. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon mechayev, and Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon says that the aid echad is going to be chayev in the carbon shvuas aedus. And Rashi here says, hamashbia eid echad, again, one makes this one witness swear. The kafir, he denies it. V'yamar shvua she'eni yodei l'cha'edus. He says, I take an oath that I don't know any testimony. So we have a machlokas tanoim here as well. Pater ha'ed mi carbon shvuas aedus. The Tana Kamma says that the witness is pater from the carbon shvuas ha'edus. Why? Because even if one witness testifies, lo have a mechayiv lehech. That one testimony, one witness, is not enough to be mechayiv someone. That's the point here. Ela shvuah, all he's going to be mechayiv is to take an oath. The halach is that if one aid testifies to some kind of monetary obligation, so it can force the person to take an oath, he can take a shvuah, but it can't force him to actually pay money because it's only one aid. Now, even though you could say, maybe this person doesn't want to take the oath and he's going to just volunteer to pay in such a case, so that's gorim l'mamun. That's a situation where what the aid did could maybe have caused indirectly a monetary obligation. So pater, by gorim l'mamun, we say pater, v'haninami gorim l'mamuninu. These cases also, all of these situations are really gorim l'mamun. There's a potential that had he told us the aidus that he knew, maybe we would have tracked down the item, but it's only a potential, it's only a gorim l'mamun, and therefore, again, according to Kamma, we say pater from the shvuas, the carbon shvuas edus, and according to Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, we say chayiv. And the Gemara explains what Rashi just explained. B'mai komiflagi, what are they arguing about? Marsavar, one master holds davar hagoyim l'mamun k'mamun dami, that if you have something that causes a monetary obligation, that's considered like a monetary obligation. Umar savar lav k'mamun dami, and the other one holds that that is not considered to be like a monetary obligation. We'll take a look at the next Rashi as well. The next Rashi goes on the previous lines. Bava lo b'motza. Again, one of the cases was that he did in fact recognize the lost object, but not the person who found it. Had he testified, that I saw it's found in a certain corner, but I don't know who found it. It's possible you would have found it by going around that neighborhood, and you would have found out. The kol shekain b'motza v'lo ba, and certainly in a situation where he recognizes the person who found it, he doesn't recognize it, meaning in all of these cases, certainly you would have been able to track it down. The Mesoras Hashas changes the gears here in Rashi to v'chol shekain ba uv'motza, which makes more sense, because all the more so had the aid been able to identify it and the person who found it, certainly you might have tracked it down. But then Rashi notes, umiu, nevertheless, mamun mamish lo mifsado, he didn't actually make him lose money by not testifying. The inami asidule, because even if he did testify, ra'inu shamatza ploni zeh, we saw that so-and-so, that Ploni found it, the person might have said, there was an onus that got away from me, upoter atzmo mishvua, and he would have exempted himself from a shvua. So in such a situation, it's not 100%. That's why all of these cases, says Rashi, are considered gorim l'mamun. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Sheshes says, hakofer b'pikadon, if somebody denies a pikadon, that means he has a deposit by him, but he denies that he has the deposit, and he doesn't owe anything. So Nasa Olav Gazlan, at that point, he becomes a thief over that pikadon, and the difference is v'chayev ba'onsin, he's now chayev in onsin. Any accident happens to this pikadon, he is going to be chayev. And the Gemara says, V'tana tuna, we have a Tana that supports this as well. V'kichesh bo, it says that he denies that this is talking about the case of carbon shvu. Again, a person who denies some kind of monetary obligation and takes a false shvu, then he's obligated, after he admits to the false shvu, he's obligated to the fifth and the carbon. So the pasuk says, V'kichesh bo, lamadnu onesh, we see from here a punishment. Azhara minayin, from where do we see an azhara, a warning? Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says, Lo sechachashu, don't deny. And the Gemara now says how this is a proof. My lav, is it not? La'onesh mammon. We're talking about a punishment of money. We'll see Rashi in a moment. Rashi is the girsa of onesh kfira. It's a punishment just for the denial. The point of the Gemara is that the Gemara at first is assuming that this punishment that the person has to pay is just for the denial. He's now chayiv in all onsim just for the denial, even if he didn't take a shvua. And the Gemara says, Lo, no, la'onesh shvua. It could be that we're talking here about a punishment for taking the oath. Maybe the psukim here are specifically talking about a case where he takes a false oath and not just a denial. So the issue over here is the obligation, does it become like a gazlan just with the denial and he's chayiv and onsin in that case, or does it require a false oath as well? Rashi here explains, Hakover b'pikadon, a person denies the pikadon, uvo edim, and witnesses come, they say that he actually has the pikadon, nasa olav gazlan, so then he becomes a thief, mishas kfira. The point of Rav Sheshes is, from the moment that he denied it, he's now a gazlan. V'aval pi shelo nishba, even though he didn't take an oath. Umikan va'elach, and that's why from that point onward, ein lo din de shomer chinam, he can't count himself as a shomer chinam. Alachayev ba'onsim im yayonis, he's not going to be chayiv even in accidents if there is an accident. That was the chiddush of Rav Sheshes. And then the Gemara brought this brisa v'chichesh ba. It says v'chichesh ba lamadnu la'onesh. It says v'chichesh ba, we understand the punishment, d'chsiv ba'asrei v'heishav es ha'gzela, because it says right after, you have to return the gezela, calls it a gezela. So Alma, you see, Kamma le bereshu say mishas v'chichesh, you see that from the moment he denies it, is now in his reshus, ad yavet hashav, until he returns it, v'zeu onsha, and that is the punishment, that he has to return it just like a gazlan. So don't we see from this brisa exactly what Rav Sheshes was saying? And then the Gemara says, Hachi garsin and my lava onesh kfir, again Rashi has the girsa of onesh onesh kefira? Isn't it a punishment just for the denial? Kilomar onesh demai. What's the punishment? Lav dianesh kefira. Isn't he being punished on the denial? Afal gav de loish daba, even though he didn't take a false shvua. And the Gemara says lo no onesh shvua. It could be that the Pesukim are talking about onesh shvua. Hay onesh da'an sheikra. This punishment of the pasuk leschayev ba'onsin, that is chayev and onsin mishum shvuas shekeri, is actually because of the false oath. Avali loish daba. But if he didn't take that oath lo, then it wouldn't be true. So there's not necessarily a proof to what Rav Sheshes said. But the Gemara continues, Hamidikatani Seifa, but from the fact that the end of this very same brisa is Vishtab is talking about a situation of a false oath, Mechlal de Reisha de Lo Ishtab, that implies that the Reisha of the brisa is talking about where he didn't take the oath, and we are just talking about the denial. The Katani Seifa, because it says at the end of this brisa, Vinishba al Sheker, it says that he swears falsely. Lamadnu Onesh, we learn the punishment. Azar Minayin, from where do we know the warning? Talmud Lomer Lo Sashakru, it says that you shouldn't lie. And therefore, the Seifa Dishtaba, from the fact that the end of the brisa is talking about the punishment for taking a false oath, Reisha de Lo Ishtab. It seems like the Reisha, again, the beginning of the brisa is not talking about for the false oath, it's talking about for the denial, and so therefore we do see that for the denial alone he becomes a gazlan. It does in fact seem to support Rav Sheshes, and the Gemara says, Amri, they say no, Idi v'Idi dishtava, both the Reisha of the brisa and the Seif of the brisa are talking about a false oath. Kan shahoda, kan shabo edim. The brisa is just making a distinction between where he admits to the false oath or when edim come and they testify against him. Also edim, if edim come, chayav ba'onsin, so then he's chayav and onsin. Oduya yodi, but if he admits to it, that's when we say chayav bekeren v'chomesh v'asham. That's when we said, as we've said earlier, that he's chayav to pay the principal and a fifth, and also bring a korban asham, and therefore this brisa would not necessarily support Rav Sheshes' contention. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Mosiv Rami Bar Chama. Rami Bar Chama asked the following question on Rav Sheshes. It says in the Mishnah in Shavuos, V'shekenegdo chashad ala Shavuah. The Mishnah is talking about cases where the plaintiff, as opposed to the defendant, takes the Shavuah. Generally speaking, it's always the defendant who takes a Shavuah. For example, in a classic case of Modem Mixas, if there's a claim made against somebody that he owes $100, he admits to part of it, he admits to $50. So it's the defendant who takes a Shavuah and says that he does not owe the rest of the money. That's usually the case. But sometimes you have situations where the plaintiff takes the shvua, and one of those cases is if the shekenegdo, if the defendant is chashad al shvua, if we already have reason to suspect that he would take false shvuas, that he would take false oaths, so then we say that the oath goes on the plaintiff instead. And the Mishnah explains, Ketzad how so? Echad shvua sa'edus, whether we're talking about, let's say, the defendant took a false shvua by shvua sa'edus, he took a false shvua, said that he didn't know testimony when he knew testimony. V'echad shvua sa'pikadon, or let's say he took an oath regarding a deposit, it was a false oath in terms of saying he didn't owe a deposit. Ve'afilu shvua shavar, even if he took a shvua in vain, in all of those situations, that's considered where he's suspect, he's a chashad ala shvua, and then the plaintiff would take a shvua instead. And so the Gemara now says, V'im Isa, now if what Rav Sheshes says is true, that by a pikadon, the denial alone makes you a gazlan, you don't need to take the shvua. So bikfirahu de ifsaleh, so then the denial alone, he should now be puzzled because a gazlan's not allowed to take a shvua. So why are we talking about shvuas hapikadon, even without shvuas hapikadon? According to Rav Sheshes, the denial alone, that makes him a gazlan. And Rashi explains, "V'shekenegdo chashad." If the defendant is chashad on a shvua, the Mesechet shvuas gabe ve'elu nishboin v'nolan. This is a Mesechet shvuas that the following people, they are plaintiffs who take oaths and they collect. That this is one of them. Mishayelo chaveiro chayev shvua. If the defendant is chayev shvua, v'chashad al shvua, but he's suspect on oaths. Shenimtza shakram b'shvua, so shekenegdo nishva v'notal. It turned out that he lied in general when he took an oath. So then it's the plaintiff that takes the oath to collect. And so Rashi says, whether he's suspect when it comes to shvuas ha'edus, he took a false shvu in terms of knowing testimony, or let's say he took an oath regarding a pikadon that was false. We saw that he swore falsely. Now, even if he's only suspect on taking an oath in vain, where he didn't have any denial of money involved, he was only doing something bad to heaven, so to speak, but nothing bad to people. In all of those cases, he is disqualified l'shvuas mammon in terms of taking oaths regarding money. And so the Gemara therefore says, V'yamisa, now if it's true Rav Sheshes, if it's true what Rav Sheshes said, the Mishas Kfiraso Nasa Gazlan, that from the moment of denial he becomes a Gazlan, so Lama Li Lemisnia Gabe Hanach Demashmat Lo Ifsalat Shas Shvua, why is it listed over here that he's only disqualified because of the false Shvua? Ki Hanach HaMishas Kfira Ifsalei, Misham Dahave Gazlan, from the moment of the denial already, he should be disqualified because he turns into a Gazlan at that point in time. And the Gemara says, Amri, they answer to that, Hachab Mayaskin, and here what are we talking about? The koi ba'agam, that the item that he's denying, or the animal that he's denying, is in the swamp. The lav kfiru, that's not actually considered a denial. When it's not in his possession, it's not easy for him to return. So there, what he might be thinking is, let me deny it. That will give me time to retrieve it from the agam, and then I'll return it. And such a person is not considered to be a gazlan, even within Rav Sheshes. Desavar ishtemitin alei, because he thinks that I'll just delay him until I'm able to bring him and return to him his property. And Rashi explains, Dekoi ba'agam, we're talking where it's in a swamp. V'chiyamar Rav Sheshes. When did Rav Sheshes say the person is a gazlan? Kegon da Amri Sahadi, that's when the witnesses say, Dechi, kafar le biyadi nakale, that when he was denying it, he had it right in his possession. So there, Dehecha de'ikol ameimar, l'shtamut echaven. So therefore the idea is, if you can say he's just trying to delay a little, ademaisi le, until he brings it lo mifsal below shvua. So there he won't be disqualified without a shvua. That's already a different situation. But when it's actually in his possession, so then the kfira alone, the denial alone, that's like he's trying to steal it. That's when it turns him into a gazlan. And the Gemara says, Tida, you should know, the Amar Ravidi Baravin, that Ravidi Baravin says, Hakofer b'milva kashul edus. If somebody denies a loan, he's actually kashul edus. It's the same basic idea. He's not necessarily trying to steal. As Rashi says, the Amar Ravidi Hakofer b'milva, if somebody denies a loan, v'lo nishve, doesn't swear. Uvo edim, and then edim come, kashul edus, he's still kosher to testify. He's a kosher aid. The milva lo etzah nitna, because a loan generally is spent. Ve'ina achsha biyado, the idea is it's not in his possession right now. V'rodz l'dchosu achatasig yado, he's just trying to push him off until he has enough money to pay him back. That doesn't necessarily make the person into a thief, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kuf Vav Amud Aleph.